Madeline. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. This is only the second time I've spoken publicly about the contents of the book, and so I'm looking forward to your reactions. We'll start my timer to keep me honest. So, is that too loud? My voice today? I'm a French historian. Some time ago, I realized that I would never understand contemporary France unless I spent some time thinking and learning about North Africa. And the result is this book about provocation and politics in French Algeria. At its center, as Madeline said, is a riot that took place in Constantine in 1934. Muslim crowds attacked Jews in the city and several surrounding towns. The police remained strangely passive, and 28 people died. So I was attracted to this event because it occurred only several years before the development of a mass-based nationalist movement in Algeria. It provides an opportunity to explore the political dynamics of a French settler colony at one of the last moments where most political actors, even most Algerian political actors, assumed that the empire would continue for the foreseeable future. That's a moment that's hard to recapture because of the dramatic cascade of events that happened soon after. By the late 1930s, a mass-based nationalist movement emerged in Algeria that eventually won independence from France in 1962 after 8 years of bitter war. The Second World War brought US troops to North Africa, and French politics were reshaped in the aftermath of the Second World War. During the same decades, tensions between Muslims and Jews throughout the world became acute because of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian catastrophe. In 1962, virtually all of Algeria's Jews departed North Africa for good, along with the French settler population. In 1934, when this riot occurred, nobody knew that all this was going to happen. Their actions that day were not unrelated to events happening elsewhere, but they were also produced in a local context that has been obscured by the rapidity and drama of all that happened later. I wanted to understand the politics of this forgotten moment, when the social relations engendered by colonialism were not yet transformed by the realization that they might soon come to an end. And I was also obviously attracted to this story because it seemed relevant to France's contemporary crisis. Attempts in the 1930s to reconcile the generous promises of French colonialism, liberty, equality, fraternity, with the violent exclusions inherent in colonial society seemed familiar to me as a researcher who spent a good number of years living and working in France. Debates about the rights of religious minorities, racial discrimination, anti-Semitism, discrimination against Muslims, social unrest, the threat of violence, all of these contemporary issues seemed connected in troubling ways with France's colonial past and with the story of French Algeria in particular. So in the book, I define provocation as a form of verbal or physical attack that is designed to draw attention to perceived differences in such a way as to heighten or escalate a sense of conflict between them. I argue that provocations are not just manipulative acts or utterances. They are powerful forms of performative action and meaning that help to create the very reality that sustains them. People attacked in the name of differences have no choice but to respond in ways that affirm the significance of these differences. And it's this that makes provocation an interesting subject for historians. Provocations are like a thread you can pull in order to understand the complicated patterns of association and differentiation that are at the heart of any society, the things that hold them together and the things that drive them apart. So in the most general sense, my book is about the way that provocative acts can transform the way that people relate to one another, making certain kinds of social and political violence seem inevitable, obvious, taken for granted, without any need for explanation, even murder. So let me tell you the story with some background elements to make it legible. The French conquest of Algeria began in 1830, and it was a French settler colony until 1962. After 1848, Algeria was legally and institutionally, and I stress those words, a part of French civil territory, considered, by the French at least, to be a part of France. In 1830, Algeria was a complex society of about 3 million people that was already integrated into the Mediterranean economy. It was frequently a net exporter of food. Algerians produced more than they consumed. They sold grain abroad, even to France. The conquest was a catastrophe for the Algerian people at many levels. A catastrophe perpetrated, of course, by the French. After several decades of settlement and the imposition of a new property regime that favored recent arrivals from Europe, Algeria suffered a famine that claimed 800,000 lives. Add to this number the further 800,000 Algerians who died during the years of conquest and subjugation, sort of decades. And the total human losses by the closing decades of the 19th century approached 1.5 million people. In 1830, the population of Algeria was remarkably diverse. It included Muslims of various religious schools, Sephardic Jews that traced their heritage to Spain, so-called Berber Jews whose presence predated the arrival of Islam in North Africa, people of Turkish descent, enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa, city dwellers, rural villagers, wealthy people, poor people, and speakers of diverse dialects of Arabic and Tamazight. In port cities, one could hear as well snippets of Maltese, Italian, Spanish, and French. Under French sovereignty, all of this diversity was swept into one legal category, the native, or indigène. So Constantine, a beautiful city situated on a dramatic gorge above a river, is in eastern Algeria. It's a provincial capital, not that far from the Tunisian border. It's about 80 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast. Out of a population of about 100,000 people in the 1930s, just over half were Muslims, about 13% were Jewish, and 34% were French settlers. Now these categories that I've used to describe the Algerian population, Muslims, Jews, French settlers, reflect real divisions in colonial society, but their meanings, but the meaning of these categories evolved through the 132 years of French presence in Algeria. In 1837, when French armies besieged the city of Constantine, Muslims and Jews fought together on the walls to repel the invaders. After 1870, for reasons that I can go into later, Algeria's Jews were granted full citizenship in the French Republic. They voted and ran for office alongside French settlers in local and parliamentary elections. They sent their children to French schools. They adopted European forms of dress. Muslims, on the other hand, were subject to a harsh penal code, paid a disproportionate share of taxes relative to their share of economic activity, and their culture was despised by the growing settler population. Algerian literacy rates, probably higher than literacy rates in France in 1830, declined after the French invasion. After electoral reforms in 1919, following the First World War, Muslims, a portion of the Muslim population could vote. About 425,000 adult men were allowed to vote after World War I, and hold office, but only in local assemblies. Muslims did not have parliamentary representation, in spite of the fact that they were over 90% of the population. The Crémieux Decree of 1870, which gave Algerian Jews citizenship, was detested by the settler population, who felt that the new law had been imposed upon them by reformers in Paris. It was seen as a violation of the distinction between Europeans and natives, indigènes, an intolerable disturbance of the social order. After Jews could vote, politics no longer mapped cleanly onto the essential divisions of colonial society. And this generated an anti-Semitic backlash from the settler population that reached a fever pitch during the Dreyfus Affair of the 1890s. Political clans that sought the control of municipal budgets and lucrative patronage networks who could make a lot of money if you controlled town halls, right? They found that they could use anti-Jewish rhetoric as a stepping stone to political power within the settler population. So this is the context that produced the career of Émile Morinot, mayor of Constantine and also a deputy in parliament when the riot broke out. Morinot embodied the political ethos of the settler establishment. First elected in 1898 on a strongly anti-Jewish platform, he had at first tried to keep Jewish pupils from public schools and attempted to exclude Jews from programs of public assistance. Now, Morinot lost his parliamentary seat in 1902 when the wave of anti-Semitism that he had ridden so successfully subsided after the Dreyfus Affair. He remained mayor during this period. And in consolidating his local power base after this loss, Morinot did a remarkable about-face. He formed a political alliance with local Jewish leaders. And the fact that Jews in Constantine found such an alliance expedient is a good indicator of how vulnerable they felt to be from anti-Semitic agitation. And why would Morinot find this attractive? He could count. Jews in Constantine were only 13% of the population, but the exclusion of Muslims from voting rights, that is about half the population of the city, meant that Jewish voters were a much larger percentage of the voters in parliamentary elections, about 25%. And Morinot's cynical and pragmatic change of attitude worked. By the 1920s, he was re-elected to parliament, and he became a reliable supporter of the Constantine's Jewish population. By the 1930s, however, the political environment had changed in quite substantial ways. On the right, anti-Jewish, anti-communist, and fascist leagues began to gather support from the middle classes, especially the Croix de Feu. This is their symbol, the death symbol. This is an authoritarian veterans organization that was nationwide in France. It had a wide following in the city. In this new climate, Morinot's pragmatic alliance with Jewish members of the municipal council began to be a liability. The settler population was moving to the right, and many of these people were explicitly anti-Semitic in their political leanings. Meanwhile, on the left, Constantine had its own anti-fascist organizations that were organizing protests against Nazism and anti-Semitism. In metropolitan France, this left-right split of the 1930s was one of the defining characteristics of political life. The background to a head-spinning few years that witnessed an abortive right-wing coup in February 1934, a popular front victory of the left in 1936, and the emergence of a right-wing collaborationist government under the German occupation in 1940. And in Algeria, this polarized atmosphere was complicated by the politics of colonialism. In the early 1930s, Mayor Morinot was also challenged by the new cohort of Muslim politicians that had entered local politics after the electoral reforms following the First World War. Now, these men were not Algerian nationalists. Mohammed Ben Jalloul, this man in the center here, seated at the table, was the president of the Federation of Muslim Elected Officials, an elected member of the Conseil Général of the Department of Constantine, a regional assembly. His main goal was to be an insider. He wanted parliamentary representation for Algeria's Muslim population. So this then is the complicated political context of the riots of 1934. Let me just summarize them again. A settler political establishment with both a history of anti-Semitism and alliances of convenience with Jewish voters. A polarized political landscape in metropolitan France that pit the left against the right in a bitter decade characterized by political extremism and street violence. An emergent cohort of Muslim political figures who were not, in fact, nationalists, but rather assimilationists. And in Algeria, a fluid situation in which political identities don't really map cleanly on the primal division between Europeans and indigènes that was perceived to be so essential to the colonial war. So the trouble of 1934 began on Friday, August 3rd, when a drunken Jewish man, a soldier in the reserves, insulted several Muslim men through the open window of a room in a mosque as they washed themselves in preparation for their evening prayers. And the significance of Friday evening in preparation for prayers, the religious context is of course important. This was the first provocation, though there was disagreement about who provoked who. The argument led to several hours of angry confrontation between Muslims and Jews that grew progressively more violent. Attempts by the mufti in the mosque to quiet the crowd failed, and a large crowd gathered later in front of the Jewish man's apartment. When soldiers arrived after dark, members of the crowd shouted, "Vive la France!" indicating perhaps that they assumed the soldiers shared their anger and resentment at their Jewish neighbors. By the time the police and soldiers succeeded in clearing the streets, a Muslim man had been shot in the stomach. We don't know who did it. He would die three weeks later. News of his lingering agony in the civil hospital spread through the town, and I think this plays a big role in further angering the population. The next day, Jewish and Muslim leaders met with the authorities and in each other's houses. Members of the municipal council were not retreating to their individual corners, but in fact talking to one another, meeting with the authorities in an attempt to prevent further violence. And I can talk more about this day, Saturday, later if you have questions. That evening, the local chapter of the International League Against Anti-Semitism, oh wait, I forgot to show you one picture, I'll just show you. This wonderful picture, which actually comes from a few years later. There aren't very many pictures of Benjamin. The photographer who took this wonderful portrait did a wonderful thing. He turned around and he also took a picture of the electors. You can see these are the photos of Benjamin. So again, Saturday, the next day, in the evening, the local chapter of the International League Against Anti-Semitism distributed a poster pleading for calm. And you can see the language: Muslim comrades, Jewish comrades, emphasizing connections, local relationships. The poster was also distributed in Arabic. These efforts to calm the situation failed. Late in the afternoon on that Saturday, word had gone out that Mohammed Ben Jalil had called for a meeting just outside the city, across the gorge, on a hillside clearing known as Les Pins. And this is a photograph that shows this region where the meeting was supposed to take place. On the opposite, you can see the gorge and the bridge here. This photograph is actually from before 1912. There was an additional suspension bridge that would have been visible after that date. But that's the only picture I have of this region. This little area on the other side of the bridge. So this would be near it. So the prefect refused to give permission for Ben Jalil's meeting at Les Pins on Sunday morning. But the next day, a crowd began to gather anyway. They crossed the Alcantara Bridge and began to gather in this area. It's probably about 1,000 people. The estimates vary. Told by a messenger that Ben Jalil was honoring Prohibition, the crowd dispersed, and groups of people began heading back over the bridge toward the city. And at that moment, a further, more malicious provocation occurred. Unidentified men ran toward the bridge from the central city, from one of the main streets, the Rue Nationale, shouting that Ben Jalil had been assassinated. At approximately the same moment, Further provocations took place on the Place des Galettes, which is a market square near the Jewish quarter, as several Jewish women were clubbed in the face by unknown assailants. Groups of armed Jewish men on the street fired shots as the crowds gathered in an attempt to intimidate them. The situation deteriorated rapidly, eventually leading to violent attacks on Jewish homes and businesses in the city that lasted nearly 8 hours. I'll just show you some of the pictures. One photo, a remarkable photo actually, shows a man performing the act of provocation for the benefit of the camera, surrounded by members of an uncertain-looking crowd. I don't know for sure who the photographer was, but I think I know who he is, and I can say more about that later. The police and the military, as I said, remained largely passive in the first hours. They limited themselves to crowd control on the main thoroughfares and attempts to control fires. Only late in the day were they distributed live ammunition and did they clear the streets. A remarkable event occurred late in the afternoon. A car carrying the chief of police and other officials approached the suspension bridge at Sidi Massid in the late afternoon. This is the other bridge that I was talking about. And they encountered a group of men on the far side of the bridge who were stopping cars and checking who was inside them. And they had unfurled a banner that read, "Vive la France." This indication of the atmosphere and the sentiments of at least a part of the crowd was something that the authorities did their best to avoid talking about in the riots aftermath. So in all, 28 people died, 25 Jews and 3 Muslims. This is a photograph of the Rue des Zouaves in central Constantine. And this doorway here is the entry to the Attali family home where 5 people were murdered. In all, 13 Jews were murdered in 2 home invasions. And these 2 home invasions were only steps apart. 5 more Jews were murdered in 3 nearby businesses. And 2 more were killed in adjacent streets. And in the book, I tell the story of the sequence of these murders as they unfold. 1 Muslim man was shot to death before hundreds of onlookers in a central square, Place Molière, by the madrasa. Several more Jewish deaths occurred as the unrest spread to outlying villages, and the Muslim boy was shot in the stomach in a nearby town in Baghdad. He died 2 years later. Taken together, these numbers make this the most lethal episode of anti-Jewish violence on French territory in peacetime during the modern era. So, a couple of things. The Jewish quarter is here, the Place des Galettes, and the Al-Qatar Bridge, where the early provocations took place, are here. These deaths actually began simultaneously with the provocations on the Place des Galettes, and they're not in the traditional Jewish quarter. They're in an area that Jews moved into as their businesses prospered, an area that was transformed when these arteries were built in the old city of the late 19th century. That's important. I can talk more about that. Let me check my time. So, can we leave that up? The map, I'm not going to have any pictures for all. In the immediate aftermath, both the local authorities and Jewish community leaders asserted that the riots must have been planned ahead of time and provoked by a group of conspirators. Within days, the police seemed to confirm this when they leaked information to the press about the arrest of a, quote, gang of throat slitters who were allegedly responsible for the majority of the killings that day, including the 2 home invasions. The arrested young men were butcher shop employees. Some of them worked in Jewish butcher shops. And the press reported that they had confessed to killings at more than one address. It's clear that the interrogations of these young men were brutal. In the subsequent trials, all of the accused recounted that they had been beaten before confessing to the police. Some of them produced medical certificates to that effect. So, in the beginning, everybody was talking about conspiracy in a small group. As the investigation progressed, however, the Governor General's office intervened, and the police leaks to the press stopped. There was something about the story of the, quote, gang of throat slitters and the manner in which the details were being made public that troubled the political leadership of Algeria. After the Governor General's intervention, the police changed their story. They stopped talking about conspiracy. They didn't mention the gang anymore. And instead, they came up with a separate list of perpetrators for each address and location where Jews had been killed. These lists provided the basis for the trials that took place in July 1935 and February 1936. Some of the individuals originally accused as being part of the gang remained on the list, but they were only accused of murders in one location. And in fact, some of them had confessed to more than one location, or had been identified in more than one location. But this never came up later. Meanwhile, an official investigating commission, also appointed by the Governor General, interviewed dozens of officials and eyewitnesses and dismissed all claims of conspiracy and provocation as unfounded. Instead, the commission blamed the riots on the religious fanaticism of the Muslim population, while also suggesting that Jews bore a measure of responsibility for having provoked the anger of the Muslims. And the trials afterwards were carefully stage-managed to confirm this account. Separate trials for each location. None of the accused were charged with murders in more than one place. The proceedings were dominated by a small number of local lawyers, established members of the political establishment. Two of the primary lawyers were in fact elected officials. One of them a close ally of Mohammed. And they argued that there were two, in the trials, that there were two possible theses about the origins of the riots. The Muslim thesis and the Jewish thesis. This was a language used in the official investigating report as well. A Muslim version and a Jewish version. The Jewish version, they said, held that the riots had been planned beforehand, executed by an organized group. The quote-unquote Muslim thesis said that it was a spontaneous local dispute that had just gotten out of hand. In every case, the trial's outcome confirmed the Muslim thesis. The Jewish thesis was attributed to the paranoia of an aggrieved minority. So, my big news is that that's not right. I have uncovered evidence, and I can talk more about the evidence in Q&A, that the authorities, in fact, knew much more than they revealed publicly. This is the document that led me into this. The police came to believe, this is actually from a different murder investigation, but one person in particular is mentioned in the document. I can explain this more later, but let me just get through the talk here. The police came to believe that the riots had been provoked by an agitator that they named Mohammed al-Mahdi. Now, al-Mahdi was a soldier in the French army. He was a uniformed soldier on the streets on August 5th. And the police connected him to a prominent lawyer, an elected official in Constantine, Etienne Miracholi, who was an ally of Mayor Mobineau, and in fact was one of the most important lawyers participating in the trials. It's a very weird connection. Military documents place El Mahdi at the site of a home invasion where 5 people were killed, that is, the house on the Rue des Oeufs. I know he was there, I've got a military document that says he was there at 1 p.m. when the killing was still happening. This also places him near the sites of other killings. El Mahdi himself appeared as a witness for the prosecution for the murders in the Attali family home. And he was represented in the trial as one of the first soldiers through the door while the killers were still present. Etienne Miracholi represented the family of the victims as civil parties to that same trial. So in the book, I can't go into the evidence here, but I conclude from a pretty wide range of documents that Mohammed al-Mahdi and a small group of co-conspirators may have been responsible for as many as 20 of the 25 Jewish deaths on August 5th. And there is more. Muhammad al-Mahdi is no ordinary conspirator. He is a notorious figure in the history of political extremism in France, known to historians and at the time to the French police as a member of a violent terrorist organization that unleashed a campaign of assassination and bombings in France in 1937 and 1938, 4 years later. This right-wing network, known in the contemporary press as the Cagoule, brought together militants from nationalist leagues in France who sought authoritarian or fascist solutions to France's political crisis in the 1930s. The Cagoule's most notorious figure, the assassin and terrorist Jean Fillot, recruited al-Mahdi into the organization. So it's in fact the police investigation of the Cagoule operations that generated this document. Al-Mahdi was arrested in 1937. This is so hot. Al-Mahdi was arrested in 1937 and detained for 10 months for his connections to this group. During the Second World War, al-Mahdi became an enthusiastic supporter of collaboration with the Nazis and a propagandist for Vichy's anti-Semitic campaign. He finished the war in the SS, a recruiter and commander of a small brigade of Algerians who fought with the Germans against the French resistance. Let me be clear. Muhammad al-Mahdi was a French Muslim man who was not an Algerian nationalist. He was a third-generation French citizen by birth. Both of his parents and both of his grandfathers were also French citizens. This is quite unusual for somebody born in 1902 in Algeria. One grandfather, married to a French woman, served in the French army. His other grandfather and his father held offices in the colonial administration. Al-Mahdi himself, let me just show you a picture of him. This is a picture from late 1942 or early 1943 in a restaurant on the Rue de la Huchette, just across the river from Notre Dame. It's a restaurant, an Algerian restaurant, run by this man, Mohamed Douaïd, that was a popular hangout for collaborators with the Vichy regime. Of course, so, he's a third-generation French citizen by birth. His other grandfather and his father held offices in the colonial administration. Al-Mahdi himself studied at the Sorbonne. He apparently began legal studies in the early 1920s before enlisting in the French army. He fought in the Rif War in Morocco, and he remained in the army until 1937. I have his service record, you can tell, when he arrived in Constantine in 1934. He was also present in Paris during the aborted right-wing coup attempt in February 1934, the so-called Stavisky riots. So, given his subsequent history in the Cagoule and under Vichy, it's important to recognize that al-Mahdi's anti-Semitism was linked to his embrace of an extreme form of French nationalism that was also viciously anti-Jewish. His engagement in 1934 was not, as I said, an expression of a specifically Muslim anti-Semitism, not at all. Sometime in the early 1930s, he became involved with right-wing militants who advocated violent attacks on the Third Republic and leftist politicians. His participation in the murders in August 1934 marked an important step in his own political evolution toward a form of fascism with deep roots in the history of French colonialism. Because al-Mahdi's participation in the Constantine murders remained unknown to most people, contemporaries blamed the city's Muslim population as a whole for the murders of August 5th. It also meant that his provocations also meant that Mohammed ben Jalloul's campaign to gain parliamentary representation for Muslims in the French Republic was tainted with the stain of murder. This was al-Mahdi's goal. He and his co-conspirators assumed that the riots and murders would drive Muslims in Algeria to forge a bond with French extremists by encouraging a shared hatred of Jews. And this was precisely the story that the Governor General's office was so anxious to conceal. The fact that a French soldier in uniform on the streets on August 5th, 1934, was implicated in the murders in at least one location could not be revealed to the public. The possibility that he was connected with French extremism was explosive. It was preferable to blame allegedly atavistic and primitive conflicts between two populations that supposedly could not tolerate each other and assert that the riots had nothing to do with France. This was, in fact, the conclusion of the official investigating commission's report, which was never published in full at the time. So my book says that this is wrong. Frenchness was a moving target in Algeria in the 1930s, and the riots had everything to do with the complex battles that were being fought in France's name. When he was arrested in 1937 for his activities in the Cagoule, Mohammed al-Mahdi announced to his interrogators, "I love France very much, and I ask only to serve her." In a political manifesto that he wrote in 1943, when he was working with the Vichy regime, he expressed a bitterness that his struggles on behalf of French nationalism had not been recognized by the government or by the settlers in Algeria. He attributed this to an anti-North African prejudice, which couldn't appreciate his willingness to participate in France's political projects. And in this manifesto, he envisioned what he called an alliance. He envisioned an alliance of the superior Aryan races of Europe with what he called the superior Berber races of North Africa, a Euro-African form of fascism, that was what he called it. Now, significantly, in this manifesto, written in 1943, al-Mahdi himself cites the riots of Constantine as a misunderstood act of French patriotism. And speaking of his bitterness against the settler establishment in Algeria, this is 1943, when he was already working for the Germans. He said, the settlers, they call us dangerous agitators and hateful Europeans. That's actually a near quote of the police document that I showed you earlier. Once the threat to their interests becomes clear, they take this step. For them, everything is a pretext. This is his quote continuing. The events of Constantine, August 5th, 1934, provoked by the abuses and insolence of the Jews, will be deformed and presented to the public as an infringement on French sovereignty, even though these pogroms were carried out to the accompaniment of people shouting, "Vive la France." I hear that as a confession. It's slightly veiled, but it's close. In the long term, al-Mahdi's provocations just a little bit more. In the long term, al-Mahdi's provocations, like his later engagement as a foot soldier for Vichy and the Nazis, were failures. His hopes that Muslim Algerians could be recruited to the cause of right-wing French nationalism remained unfulfilled. His dreams of a Euro-African fascist alliance in the Second World War found few supporters. But the murders that al-Mahdi helped to organize in Constantine terrorized Algerian Jews and permanently tainted any discussion of political reform in Algeria. Frankly, political reform in Algeria was probably never going to succeed anyway, but this certainly didn't make it any easier. After the murders committed on August 5th, the ethno-religious boundaries in Constantine seemed to harden into implacable blocks. The political experiments that I spoke about earlier, that crossed the boundaries that separated European from quote-unquote native or indigene, became much more difficult to sustain. And let me make this clear too. The conventional wisdom about this event, in fact, is based on the official investigating report and the version of the story that emerged from the trials in 35 and 36. The report and the lawyers' arguments at the trials were part of the cover-up that hid Mohammed al-Mahdi's role. Their version of the story stated that the violence was the natural and inevitable result of hardened ethno-religious boundaries that were a perpetual part of North African history since time immemorial. I am arguing the opposite. The period was characterized by all sorts of political experiments that crossed the boundaries, separating Jews from Muslims, French from indigènes, European from Algerian, and it was the violence of August 5th, fueled by Almaty's agitation and the sensational murders, that hardened the social boundaries between ethno-religious communities. So, I've told here a local story about a community in distress. At the same time, in a very real and important way, this was a French event, shaped by French institutions, French laws, and the political dynamics of the French colonial regime. Curiously, at least 2 books on anti-Semitism in France have been written without mentioning the Constantine riots at all. This silence, however regrettable, is less astonishing than it might appear. An extraordinary amount of work went into the construction of this moment as an Algerian event, rather than a French one. For the local political establishment, this work was more important than anything else. It was more important than commemorating the dead, more important than finding justice for the families of victims, more important than remedying the inequities of a colonial system that were implicated in the explosion of hatred that killed 28 people. And because of that work, it is just as hard for historians today to talk about the riots in Constantine, just as hard as it was for contemporaries in the 30s. The violence took place in an Algerian city that now seems far from France. Jews no longer live there. The Algerians who do face their own challenges with the violent history of decolonization in the 20th century. The political complexities of the French Empire's fragility in the interwar years, and its failed efforts to imagine a world in which Muslims and Jews could be simultaneously Algerian and French, have been understandably overshadowed by the dramatic events that took place in the decades that followed. This is the story of a terrible event that unfolded in the harsh glare of imagined futures that never arrived. Thank you.
Do we need a mic? Is that okay? Is that okay?
I felt like my voice boom.
Is this, do we need a mic? Okay, no. Okay. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to read your books. It's an absolutely marvelous book in many ways. I think I'm going to underline 3 lessons, 3 important lessons for the historians and for the people who are interested in Algeria and in French imperialism and in imperialism in general. The first lesson, I think, is a very general lesson for the historian, the understanding of historical events. My voice tends to go down, so if you don't, just raise your hand. Just notice I raise it again. How do we understand apparently completely irrational moments, events, right? Where all the lines of intelligibility seem to be blurred. Like Muslims rallying in a Jewish quarter in Constantine in the name of La France, right? Like shouting Vive la France, that seems completely out of line with everything we think about. We think we know about Algeria in the 1930s. So here, I think George Russell's book is inscribed in a long trajectory of books that have tried, work research that have tried to understand apparently irrational bursts of violence, like Anaconda, The Village of the Cannibals, or even Brewer's book on Constantine, of the name of that's the story. Benjamin Burke's book is
Desert coffee.
I think so too. And more closer to his work, Jacques Beck comment about the 1934 riots, which he has described as an organized plot or an act of provocation, the spontaneous, this is working now, sorry.
Working now, right? Yes. So, Jacques Berck already mentioned these events in a very well-known book, France, South Africa, the Maghreb between the two wars, and he described them as an organized plot or an act of provocation, a spontaneous outburst or a deliberately created diversion, only the history of events, when its secret aspects are revealed, may perhaps shed light on the direct cause of this incident someday. And Professor Cole tells us in the next sentence, this book has revealed some of these secrets. And that's to a large extent, the book is about revealing the secret of this 1934 riots, which are actually very understandable beyond the apparent irrationality. So traditionally, this event has been very conveniently interpreted by the French administration and by some historians, right, as a atavic Muslim, as an expression of atavic Muslim anti-Semitism and fanaticism, and sometimes as the result of the provocation by the Jews themselves. So your main culprit, Mahdi, said that, but also it's also a narrative that you find in the administration at the time, right? So against this narrative, especially the first one, which is a very traditional narrative, to speak about anti-Semitism in general in the Maghreb, you give us two sets of concepts, right? The first one is, actually, since we didn't speak very much in your presentation, but is a fascinating aspect of your book, which is the very complex socio-political conditions in Algeria in the 1930s, and especially in Constantine. The sense of homelessness of Algerians in their own land, and in contrast to that, the political advantages given to Jews since the Decret Crémieux of 1870 were made, obviously, for citizens on the political sphere, but were constantly marked by difference in housing, in economic dimension of society. And you also underline the constant rivalry between those two groups, not as something that is an atavistic, foe, but something that is constantly exploited by the French population, and especially by the long-term and French anti-Semitism in Algeria, since at least the last decade of the 19th century, and in the 1930s by proto-fascist groups, and which was, for example, as the Croix de Feu tried to recruit among Algerians in the 1930s, right? So proto-fascist group really trying to put out Algerians, Muslims in their anti-Semitic struggle. And also what you tell us here, I mean, for me that's a key element of your demonstration, the importance of the form provocation as a social practice, right? The multiplication of incidents and how these incidents create memories, very short-term memories of local grievances, local conflict that gets built up. So there's a long chapter that explains, actually two chapters that explains all the small incidents that have happened, and more importantly, the memory of them, like almost like, I don't know, call fighting, but constantly remembering their, past grievances, and then the escalation of the conflicts based on this accumulated set of frustrations. So again, those conflicts are not another sign of the mark of an ancestral fold, but they are about very concrete, material, almost material and political place in society. So this with space, with the occupation of the city, with access to streets, to cafe, to the market, to class, right? In population, with the triangulation, it's not just about Muslims and Jews, it's also the relations with the French settings in Constantine. So that's the first set of codes, right? It's very well explained, extremely convincing. The second set of codes is the conspiracy, right? The secret that Jacques Berck is referring to. You have revealed the secret, right? That there was a conflict, there was a conspiracy. There is no secret. There was someone who did the ultimate provocation. Which we're not entirely sure, right? At some point you tell us there's a very strong network of causes that seem to lead to that, but on the other hand, you're being very careful, and that's one of the great challenges of your great advantages, of great qualities of your book, is that you tell a very carefully told story, right? And so you show us the converging suspicions that we can have about this conspiracy, but we're pretty sure. So we understood something about these virtual battles. We have revealed the secret, and we have spoken about the So the second lesson for me is exactly about that. It's about how to write a history of causes, a causal history, and especially the history of the causes of violence. Those are two things that historians have actually not done very well. They actually even shunned. I think causal history in the past 20 years, right, most historians don't want to speak about causes, and they don't want to give a causal, many of them don't want to give a causal explanation of the events they think. They think about affinities, they think about convergence, but they're very careful with the language of causality, and actually you do that. You actually relax, in a way, the field of causality, and I find this very, very endearing. And you do that with a fantastic craft of in your writing. Your writer's craft is really amazing. It seems to me, I don't know if you had that in mind when you were writing, but there is a kind of ocean dimension to your book, right? The movie by Kurosawa, where you have 4 characters who tell a story of a murder, right? The murder of a samurai, and each of the characters provide a very subjective, self-serving, and contradictory rendering of the event. And we don't know the truth at the end, right? There is a resolution, but there is no truth. And everybody seems to tell the story in the light of their own, or of his or her interests. This is, so your story is a little different, because we have a conclusion, we have a comfort, we know who did it. But there is a similar move. You tell us a story, the first story of the events, right? And when at some point you discover Maddie's, the accusation about Maddie's in 1938, and you tell us the story. So you tell the story 2 times, and not exactly the same way because it would be extremely boring, right? But once you have discovered Maddie's trace in 1938, you retell the story. And I would like just to quote one passage where you tell us what you do with that. Page 204. You tell us, so you find this note, right, about this accusation in the police arrest in Paris and in Algeria in 1938. There is a note from a police official, and you said that mentioned the fact that Maddie is known as one of the writers, one of the authors of the Provocation mentioned, and you said a single note, however suggestive, is a thin reed on which to hang a revised explanation of the 1934 riots. So this is written, right? Said on this reed, we're going to attach another 70 pages, right? No explanation of what happened in 1934. So here you have, among the historian's craft as it is deployed, in the historian's workshop, right? On the reed is attached to a whole new set, the retelling of the story from this perspective. And then in that case, you tell us, let's not believe the anti-Semitism, right? That was in the Constantine prefecture that retailed the event. You guard us from adhering to the causality established by the actors themselves, right? And rather than believing all this causal explanation that the actors come up with, the anti-Semitism of the last things, you actually tell us the only way we can understand really what happened is actually by telling the story, by retelling the story, and by looking painstakingly at the events themselves as they have unfolded. And that is also something that I found very surplus for the historian and for the interested reader. You tell us to be careful with categories in Algeria, in common situations and beyond. You insist on the fluidity of the categories, especially the fluidity of the categories Jews and Muslim, which is, in a way, the solidity of this category and the constant conflict between those two groups is and remains the way we think about a lot of social conflicts. You actually do another workshop and move, it seems to me, in the introduction of the book. You tell the story of you give us the first version of the events without mentioning Jews and Muslims, right? It's all French people in a French place. And you explain to us, we don't understand it. You retell the same story of the events of the riots, only using Jews and Muslims, right? So Jews were attacked by Muslims, and we don't understand it better. And this is through this move, through this kind of stylistic intervention, you tell us two things. One, we kind of knew already, right, that the categories of colonialism do not work, they're not adequate to describe the situation. But you tell us something that I think is pretty new, at least something that is a little more counterintuitive, that is, the religious categories do not work either, right? One of the fascinating moments in the book that I have not recalled in your presentation is that actually the moment that initiated the riots in the first altercation, which was which was a provocation, right? It was the first provocation, was actually the fact of a certain Elias Khalifa, right? Who is a Jewish man, born up to the Jewish parents, but we learned very quickly that he was orphaned, and that his father died when he was 4.
Parents were divorced.
They were divorced. His father died. No, whatever. But his mom actually moved in with a Muslim man, right? Something that seems completely counterintuitive when you think about these two communities constantly fighting. And maybe this Muslim man was the father of Elias Khalifa. So here we talk like of the Jewish man who was supposed to be the first provocateur here, right? So here you have, same thing with Mahdi. Mahdi is a Muslim, right? So we tend to attribute all the different categories and qualities of Muslimitude, of Muslimness to this man, but actually he's a French of third generation, right? He's a French citizen. He has been for third generation, which for people who don't know the situation in Algeria at the time, being French and having acquired French citizenship in the late 19th century, because his third generation is born 1902, right? So his grandfather could be something that happens in the 1880s or something. That was bad. I mean, it was a sign of betrayal, right? Only 5,000 families became French. 5,000 individuals between 1870 and 1940 throughout Algeria, millions of people. And this was, the fact that he became actually a fascist, a collaborator, and that he was a provocateur. Maybe, I would say, I don't know, maybe that was a way of reasserting his unjustness in a context where everything pointed in the Algerian society to the fact that he had betrayed, his family has betrayed. In any case, what you show us very, very brilliantly, I think, is what you said in your talk. That is that those categories were very fluid, that people could move from one to the other. So the rigidity of categories cannot be the cause of violence. Actually, it's a result of violence. There is a hardening of categories after 1934, Constantine. Okay, so all of this was really wonderful with the 3 lessons I have learned. And then I have a question. Maybe slightly provocative. The book does many moves to distance Muslims in Algeria from anti-Semitism, right? This is not a story, the riots are not a story of Algerian anti-Semitism, of Muslim anti-Semitism in Algeria. Mahdi, a French citizen of third generations, provoked it. He loved France, tells us, right? You also tell us on page 424 that the fact that people were shouting "Vive la France" and there were other signs of that, and maybe some of the rioters were thinking that this was a patriotic act, right? You tell us about the investigation by the Grand rabbi of Constantine, Rabbi Azenbeth, right? You showed that that he said that the riots actually served Murillo's interest, the mayor of Constantine's interest, right? And that it is possible, you tell us on page 251, that it is possible that Mahdi was working actually for Murillo.
I would have liked to have been able to say it, but I can't.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, and you do that very, again, with a lot of talent, right? The talent, right? Very deft, kind of.
I make it seem like it was true, even though I can't prove it.
Yes. You tell us also that those riots provoked a sense of satisfaction in French spectators, right? The woman in protest on the page, that which actually leads you to call this moment a French Arab movement. The riots are a French Arab movement, you tell us. You also quote the fact that maybe around Mahdi there were Europeans in disguise, right? You had their suspicion of a few men were actually European citizens, European were disguised in Arab men. To the point that, on page 158, I think it's important to quote you. You tell us, anti-Jewish, so in the chapter 10, that is after the riot, the description of the riot, the shock and containment. That's the title of the chapter. It said, anti-Jewish sentiment was widespread in many sectors of Constantine's society, in the local military, in the police department, among middle-class supporters of Croix de Feu, and in the small groups of right-wing extremists who rallied around figures such as Henri Gautier. So anti-Semitism here is only a French thing. The anti-Semitism is only a French name. This is a French quality. This is a French secularist movement. There is no lasting anti-Semitism. So, in your attempt to show us that, to reverse, the French narrative, or the French administration, the French judges, that had nothing to do with France, you reverse the explanation and you tell us has nothing to do with Muslim anti-Semitism, right? It's a French story. You want to shift the blame, right, from the Muslims. The Muslims didn't do that. And we are convinced this is not a Muslim story of Muslim anti-Semitism. I want to be very clear about that. This is weak. You are making your point very clear. But does that mean that it's not at all a story of Muslim anti-Semitism? And what does it tell us about anti-Semitism in Algeria? How different? I have an archive of, I prepared it, but I have an archive of, I work on Algeria in the last third of the 19th century, or most of the 19th century, and I do a lot of petitions by Muslim inhabitants in lots of different places, with tons of petitions, and complain a lot about the discrimination of the victim, the oppression in Algeria. And this is not an archive I ever put, because this is an archive which I'm very comfortable with. I don't go to that archive, but in those petitions, often you have spontaneous expression of anti-Semitism. I'm quoting a document from the 1870s, after the Défricanerie, after the Mokrani riots of 1871, which were met with an incredible amount of repressive violence by the state. And so, this archive, it's a petition written to the French Parliament, actually. And, there is fantastically interesting political, discourse about the tyrannical measures, oppressive, and organized in the shadows of ignorance of power, speaking about French administrators. And at the end, so it goes like that for like 2 paragraphs, and then at the end, trust the Jew that ruled the tail upon slaying the pig and use it to humiliate the Arab who defends France's honor. Who defends France's honor in its acquisition of independence? Who defends France in France? The Jew or the Arab? The answer is the Arab. Okay, I have tons of archives like that. I never, this is not what I work, so I didn't mention this. But I want to say that there is something about anti-Semitism in Algeria in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So telling the story of the riots as a French colonial event, as an event that was absolutely framed in French terms, as an event that would have fit into, you know, a political and social world brought by organization and degree. The archives I'm quoting here, I think, is very much linked also to the Décret Réunion and to a sense of, you know, political rivalry that was launched by the Décret Réunion in the 1870s. So I'm not saying this to actually go back to the thesis of anti-Semitic, you know, atavism about Muslim fanaticism and intolerance. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying here is that there is, to some extent, I mean, there are forms of expressions of anti-Semitism, so it's not just something that the settlers have instilled in at that moment. It's not just a French story. You finished your talk and you finished your book by telling us that if I finish it, let me go to again. Sorry. Other futures were and are possible. I don't believe those futures are possible if we completely deflect this history of anti-Semitism in Algeria. If we can completely put this on the back burner, if we can completely make anti-Semitism a French story. That's it.
That's a great question. Should I respond first, or should we open for questions?
Respond? Yeah.
Respond. Okay. Thank you for that wonderful summary of the 3 lessons. I took careful notes, and I'm going to tell other people. Very good. Let me just respond first to the question. The question of Muslim anti-Semitism in Algeria. So, as Emmanuel said, in the book, I developed a long discussion about the ways in which relationships between Jews and Muslims change after the arrival of the French and the establishment of the political system. And it's true that I tell the story of anti-Semitism as a kind of as something that emerges from the structure of the laws about political participation. And the main way in which Muslim antipathy toward Jews is encouraged is because Jewish political leaders in towns and cities feel obliged to ally themselves with the settler establishment for protection because they're vulnerable. And that settler establishment is the most vocal opponent of reform that will give Muslims a greater voice. So there was a kind of structure of the political system that drove Jews out of vulnerability to ally with the very people who were ensuring that Muslims could get nothing out of the political system. That's true. There is, what I would say about this is we need a different word to talk about hostility among Muslims in Algeria and hostility from the settler population. That anti-Semitism in some ways is not, it assumes, if you use the same word, it assumes that the origins and the cause are similar, that the rhetoric is similar, and the logic is similar. Now, there is no doubt that you can go back the last 400 years and 500 years of history, going back into Ottoman history, find plenty of episodes of social tension between Muslims and Jews. There are attacks on Jews in the beginning of the 19th century. I don't like using the same word and it's to assume continuity because my method in this book, in any case, is to insist that there are kind of local complexities that need to be explored before you make any claims about continuities. To just say that Muslims are anti-Semitic, they were anti-Semitic in the early 19th century and they did it again in 1934, hence not much need to explain things, makes you miss so much. Now, it's not hard to find examples of tension between Muslims and Jews in the late 19th century, and certainly after the riots. Muslims in Constantine were convinced that many more Muslims had been killed and that their bodies were hidden from them. And it's rumor. It was not true, But they were convinced in the aftermath that they were the victims, and because they remembered that the drunken Jewish man was the provocateur, they had a deep sense of grievance. After the riots, there is a turn toward anti-Jewish resentment in the Muslim population that's palpable. Before the riots, the story is much more complicated. And in fact, settler anti-Semites had been trying to provoke violence against Jews by Muslims repeatedly, over and over and over again. And most of the time it didn't work. And at this moment, in August of 1934, it did. And so the point was to try and figure out what was special about that moment. I think it has something to do with the particular crescendo of Mohammed ben Jalloul's political activities and his disappointments at not being recognized. So I just don't want to generalize. I did find plenty of examples of Muslims saying angry things about Jews. I'm probably not equipped. I don't have the linguistic capacities. I studied Arabic for a while, but I can't skim Arabic sources by any means, which is very difficult for me to look through them. Somebody working in those sources might be able to kind of write a richer history about tensions between Muslims and Jews here. Let me just give one other example that's connected to this. It's quite, because Muslims and Jews come into conflict in Palestine in the late 1920s, starting in the middle of 1929, even earlier, right? So, many people have assumed that there's a natural connection between what's happening in Palestine and what's happening in Constantine only a very few short years later. And I looked, and I really only found one reference, and it's in an Arabic language newspaper from the early 1930s, where it's clear that there were some Muslim elites in Constantine who were disturbed at what was happening in Palestine and were talking about it. But I didn't find any evidence of something that was trickling down to large numbers of people that could account for bringing thousands of people out into the street. Likewise, I know that there were in Constantine several Jewish families who had subscriptions to Zionist publications, but there was not a substantial number of Zionists. And the relationship between Muslims and Jews was a local thing going on for a long time. So I'm cautious about making generalizations about Muslim anti-Semitism. I prefer to think about it as something that's rooted in specific moments. So I'm going to stop there. Take the questions. Should I call them? Or?
I'm going to.
Hi, thank you very much. So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Madeline Booker. I'm working with Emmanuel here in the department on the politics of taxation in the French colonial empire, and we work a bit on Algeria. And I guess my question has to do with the socio-economic determinants of violence and how you look at them in your book. I'm particularly interested in this intersection between political subjection and economic predation, and you do talk about the fiscal inequalities in Algeria at this moment, but it seemed to me from what I read that you were pushing them in the background a little bit, and I was wondering why this move, because after all, this is the Great Depression, Ben Jalloul's entry into colonial economic life or political life is through tax resistance in the early 30s. Algeria was written about, he's written a little on taxation, but when he did, it was on taxation of the Constantinois. So I guess, my question is really about the economic determinants and whether this is just a political story, just a story of political discrimination.
Thank you, that's a great question. So here's the problem with socioeconomic determinants. They provide you with an explanation for understanding why there might be resentments and tensions in general, but they can't explain why things happen at one moment rather than another. So again, to refer to this point that provocations sometimes work and then sometimes don't, makes it hard for me to say that socioeconomic determinants are anything but a kind of background that creates a kind of existing fund of resentments, but that need to be lit by something else, right? And so you're absolutely right that Benjalul is engaged in these tax revolts, and that's what his popularity largely comes from those. And he takes a very confrontational line against the administration, and it's certainly a part of the background. And you know, I guess in some things there's like this. There's things that are creating pressure, and then there are things that are releasing pressure, right? And it's certainly one of the things that's creating pressure. The other socioeconomic determinant in the 1920s is usury, actually. And it's not Jews. It's the French settler population as a whole is making a lot of money loaning the Muslim population, particularly in the countryside in the 1920s, is desperate to buy more land. And the settler population is taking advantage of this to give loans at exorbitant rates of interest. And it becomes such a problem that the prefects are generating reports about it. And they suspect that it might be Jews who are doing it. Who else would be responsible for usury, right? And they go through it, they actually have these lists where the Jewish names are circulated, are circled in red pen. And it turns out that the Jews are not participating in usury in any way more than, proportionate to their presence in the population. It's the French settlers as a whole. So there's quite a bit of, there's lots of evidence to say that Muslim colonial subjects in Algeria have plenty to be pissed off about, right? That their situation was dire. But it's the timing of it that mattered to me. And that's how, that's why I began this sort of look at a political conjunction.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I had a question that stems from your talk, but also your response to Manuel on anti-Semitism, because one of the things that is difficult, I think, in the project is that you're trying to do this very careful historicization of these transcendental notions. Like, and the two I'm thinking here is fascism and anti-Semitism. So I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more about El Mahdi's fascism, specifically, like what makes it fascist? Is because I was thinking actually of my advisor, Dominic Capper's obsession with the kind of violence that comes with fascism and the idea of scapegoating, and so a kind of idea of violence as regenerative of the social body, and the scapegoating of, for example, Jews as something that you have to eliminate to regenerate the social body. So in that sense, you could see the kind of possible compatibility in this case of potential anti-Semitism or something like that. But then also in relation to what you answered to Emmanuel, do you think there is such a thing as anti-Semitism as a conceptual category? If it's not, or is it just, is it even a category that can be useful, or should we just talk about just specific versions of violence or hatred or something?
Well, we're kind of stuck with the word.
Right.
Right? I mean, anti-Jewish hostility, it's a thing. Historians have to deal with it. This book, what's his name, the professor at Northwestern, Hayes, is it Peter Hayes, who recently wrote a very good ending teach the Holocaust called Why? It's actually great for people who have to teach this material. And he talks about the problem with the word anti-Semitism. He says there's two problems with the word anti-Semitism. There's the anti-part and Semitism. And the anti-part is this, that it's a word that has to stand in for everything from, jokes and bad taste on one end and genocide on the other, right? It's not a useful tool for somebody who's trying to understand something historically. And the Semitism part is clear, right? Who's a Semite? What's a Semite? Why is that the word? It's an accident that we use that word. It goes back to the 1870s in Germany that we use the word to talk about anti-Jewish hostility. But the Semite is not a historical subject that is, so the problems with the term are well known. And nevertheless, there is something fungible about anti-Jewish hostility, particularly in the modern period. It seems to translate so easily from one context to the other, from Imperial Russia to Republican France to Nazi Germany to North Africa, right? So we kind of want a word that will do those things, but when we use it, we have to be very attentive to its particular valences and its deeply contextual nature, right? So there's religious anti-Semitism, there's secular forms of anti-Semitism that emerged in the 19th century, there's biological racism in anti-Semitism. There are many different kinds, and we have to, I think, be specific about that. So I use the word when I teach, but I make no claim.
What about the fascism?
Okay, fascism. So, but here's the thing about Muhammad al-Mahdi and fascism. I'm not going to get into it in a room where people probably know Robert Pattinson very well. I'm not going to. But let me just say this about al-Mahdi and fascism. So for al-Mahdi, I don't have very many words written by al-Mahdi. He's really a kind of foot soldier. He's an intellectual marquet. He tries to write several novels and French. They remain unfinished by the end of his life. And then he writes this strange manifesto when in 1943, when basically things are crumbling around him. Right? He's ended up, on the side of the Germans. I would say he's a fascist by association, by the companies that he keeps writing. Xavier Vallat employs him at the Commission for Jewish Questions. He's an associate of Eugène Deloncle and the people at the Kabul. He rallies to Marcel Déat in 1940. So, by any measure, if there are French fascists, those are the people we point to, and al-Mahdi knew them and worked with them and associated with them. I'll stop there. We can talk about
Thanks, Joshua. That was terrific. I haven't read the book, but from the way you presented it, I can already sort of get a feel for the archive fever, the excitement of this investigative kind of work, which I really love. In terms of ready for the comments, which were terrific, and give me the opportunity to ask a question about causality, because that you raised this definition, and it's another reason I want to read the book. It seems to me as if there's a tension though, because you started off by telling us you wanted to capture something about the moment, right? And hence the sort of effervescence, the collective crowd, the chaos, the irrationality, the burst of violence, without thinking too much about what would happen afterwards. Take this event on its own terms and its moment of horizon of possibility, right? And that's one thing. But then when it comes to reconstructing, you've got your evidence, your trace that al-Mahdi might be the culprit in all of this. But when it comes to then backing up this one sort of semi-smoking gun archival trace that you have, you then proceed, I don't want to say teleologically, but you go backwards from what he will become later on. And the causality then works backwards. It's based on what he will become that we can presume that he might well have been involved in this kind of activity, plotting this kind of trajectory for his own becoming already back then. So this is a question of how we work as historians with causality forwards, backwards, in its moment, present, and just in terms of, again, I read the book, but so in terms of how you reconstruct it as a narrative, I'm just curious if you thought about doing this move.
Yeah, I spent years. But for a long time I had this. So the book does two things. It's a kind of social history of violence in the community that is very richly documented in narratives. It's not, that part is, and then there's this murder mystery and its cover-up. There the evidence is fragmentary. And that poses terrible problems for narrative, because there's this story about ways in which the relationship between Muslims and Jews changes over time, and I have all this street level stuff that I talk about. And there, my goal is to talk about sort of the preconditions of an event like the riot without ever assuming that it's inevitable. It doesn't have to, it could have worked out other ways. And that was actually hard to do because all of these files about these people punching each other in the market or disputes in the stairwell between neighbors and rumors, and hundreds and hundreds of these reports, they were assembled after the fact, after the riot had already taken place, and then put in a file called anti-Semitism. And a lot of times it was just a dispute where there were a bunch of people present, and one of them was Jewish. And then we filed anti-Semitism. So like, for them, the inevitability was a given. And I had to read these documents in a different way and try to understand what was happening, but not assume that they were leading inevitably. And I tried very hard to do that in the first half of the book. In the second half of the book, where I'm trying to prove what I believe, which is that Al-Mahdi was a conspirator, that he was involved in some way, that he committed his. The evidence was very fragmentary, and for those of you who work, historians, when you're working with fragmentary evidence, the hard part is that every fragment has to be contextualized. You have to explain to the reader why they should believe what's in it. And if you have one fragment, you know, a list with Al-Mahdi's name in it from 1934 that puts him at the address, and then another fragment from a police investigation in 1938 for a different murder that contains a reference to him and Constantine. You have to find a way to tell the story of both of those fragments. It was really hard to figure out how to do that. And you can read that if it works. But here's the thing about causality. So I teach graduate students. I teach them to be skeptical. I teach them to be very skeptical of archives that come from colonial states, because colonial states have mostly just one or two things that they want to do, and they make the documents do it, right? You can't just believe them. I've read Subaltern Studies, right? The Pros of Counterinsurgency, very good article about how not to believe colonial archives. And at the same time, I did adopt a kind of position. You call me an empiricist, call me a naive empiricist, but at some point I decided I have to believe some of these documents if I want to make an argument about what happened. And I decided, and nothing about my training, in fact, led me to believe documents. My first book is it's all discursive, it's all logic, this, rhetoric, that, it's all about language. Here I was actually, in a kind of naive way, I wanted to know what happened. And because people died, I wanted to make sure that I was right. There was a kind of responsibility. So I said, look, it's a colonial bureaucracy, it's dedicated to the subjugation of 90% of the population, but it does also have an interest in what's going on. They collect information because they want to know. And sometimes they say things that, and I basically started triangulating. If I had one document that said something, I would think that it could be true, but I would wait and see if I could triangulate it with other documents, and I kind of built it layer by layer.
I'm wondering also this, when it comes to individuals, because we think of individuals as biographically.
Oh, okay, we're going on.
We can make assumptions about based on what they're going to do afterwards, what they might be plotting to do.
So I do that, but I try and do that very explicitly. I say nothing about his sulfurous future, right? As a collaborator, proves anything about what he did. I don't use that to prove that he was there that he did it. I do suggest that we can learn something about his possible motives. And I try, you can see what you think, and I try and hedge it. I try and be very honest about what I'm doing with the documents. And so nothing about what comes later proves it, but it does, if you can prove it another way and you accept it at least as a possibility, then it's worth looking at his manifesto written in 1943 to get a sense of what his motives may have been. Because I don't have anything that he wrote.
Could you say a little bit more about the spatial
questions that you gestured to a few times, and you said you might come back to them.
In the city.
Yeah, in your presentation, there was several maps and it shows about the importance of Jews in different neighborhood photographs, different kinds of, what it is to do about colonial space or Jewish quarter.
So this is a big part of the first half of the book. The city changes under French colonialism. It was actually in the late Ottoman period, the Jewish quarter itself moves. On one side it's near the Kasbah, on one side it moves over towards the gorge by the Alcantara Ridge. The cities, initially they build settler communities outside the walls of the central city. So the French quarter in Constantine is built down the plain below where the Golden Wall was made at the conquest. And there's new communities there. And then there's construction on the other side of the gorge. And then in the late 19th century, they penetrate through the central city with several wider avenues and European-style apartment buildings are built. They construct a cathedral. And it's along those avenues that some of the more prosperous Jewish merchants move into for their stores, particularly along the Rue Nationale that leads to the bridge. And it's clear when you look at the sort of tensions in the 1920s and 30s, there's lots of things going on that have to do with who has the right to participate in these spaces of sociability that were created by these changes that accompany the construction of these buildings. So cafe terraces, the streets, the bars, many of the disputes, they have, it's Muslims and Jews who go to the same cafe and play dominoes and drink together every day. It's many disputes have to do with relationships in groups of mixed gender, what it means to associate with young unmarried women on a cafe terrace. Lots of these disputes, they have to do with the ways in which colonial spaces are coded, right? There's a kind of French form of sociability that young people are participating in. Some Muslim men are there, some Jewish men are there, some European men and women are there. And those can become flashpoints. I talk about that in the book. The particular space of Les Pins, which is the site where Benjamin was supposed to give us a speech on the morning of August 5th, is a particularly important place in the city for political gatherings. And I think it's in May, I can't remember the look, it's about 11 weeks before the riots. The last big political gathering of Muslim political leaders and religious leaders happens at Les Pins. And Mohammed Ben Jalloul appears there on a stage with Abdelhamid Ben Badis, who's the most important Muslim cleric, Islamic cleric, and Constantine, the leader of the Islamic Reform movement. And it's unusual. The two of them, they're actually related. Ben Jalloul is related to Ben Badis' family by marriage. James McDougall talks about that in his book. And but their concerns are different. Ben Jalloul is politically active. At this point, Ben Badis is very conservative and doesn't engage in overt political activity. But I think that's actually very significant that the last big public gathering by sort of leaders of the Muslim community, the political leader Mohammed Ben Jalloul and Ben Badis, happens at Les Pins. And then that's where people gather the morning, and it's where the first provocation about Ben Jalloul's assassination occurs as they're moving back across the bridge. The other places, of course, that are very important are the cemeteries. The Muslim cemetery is a very important place for meetings. The Jewish cemetery was where all the town's leadership was the morning of August 5th, because Elie Malkouni, who was one of the Jewish leaders, in fact responsible for the alliance with Mayor Mohinel so many years before, had died. And the funeral of this Jewish political figure is the morning that the riot breaks out. So there's a way in which those spaces are. There's also a funeral a few days later of the victims. Noma gives a speech. Molino, who I actually believe at least knew that the disturbances were coming. I can't prove that he ordered it, but I think he knew. Certainly the Jewish leadership concluded that later. And many of the reporters and investigators from Jewish organizations who came from outside have come to that conclusion. I think that only 3 days after these people when people died on Sunday, and on Wednesday he gives this terrible speech where he expresses his shame that this could happen 130 years after the French after the Jewish speaking. So those spaces now they get appropriated and used for political advantage.
Okay, on this note.
Thank you all for
Thank you
coming.
very much.
Terrific questions.